All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Niskanen Center for the Election Security and COVID-19 briefing. I'm Kodiak Hill-Davis. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at Niskanen Center, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. This is the second briefing in our new and exclusive series for our friends and supporters. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Niskanen, we're a 5-year-old 501c3 think tank in Washington, D.C., and while we are nonpartisan, our work is often described as center-right and focused on free market solutions and the promotion of the principles of an open society. A quick note before I introduce today's speakers, there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we welcome you to submit questions throughout the discussion, and we'll answer those at the end. Our speakers today are Christy DePena, Jeffrey Cabaservice, and I will also provide some insight on our efforts on the Hill. Christy is the Vice President of Policy at the Niskanen Center. A lawyer by trade, she focuses on international security and immigration, and her work has been cited in the New York Times, the National Review, and Newsweek. Jeff is the Director of Political Studies at Niskanen, a historian who focuses on political science and the Republican Party. Jeff is a published author many times over and is routinely featured in the Washington Post, Politico, and The Guardian. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Christy DePena.
Good afternoon, all, and thanks again for joining us for a discussion about a topic that I think is obviously important for a number of reasons you're all aware of, but is increasingly becoming one of the most important kind of decision or inflection points for lawmakers to consider with regard to future relief packages that we can expect to see in the coming weeks, which makes this a very timely discussion. So for my part, what I aim to do to set the stage is to tell you answers essentially to some of the questions that we've been getting from staff on Capitol Hill about this issue. So talking a little bit about what election security really means and where some of the election authorities lie, what previous crises have meant for our elections. And then I want to give you a quick overview of the influx of new legislative efforts that we've seen recently on election security and that we can expect will in some way impact the next iteration of relief packages that Capitol Hill considers in the coming weeks and months. So a secure election, at least for people in the US, generally means that we've successfully ensured that voters and candidates and poll workers and our ballots, our vote counts, were all free and fair and that they were really safe from any undue influence. We're lucky in that we don't have to worry about the violence that occurs during elections in some other places, but obviously we are knee deep in an election season that is relatively unlike any that we've had before, and we certainly need to adapt to ensure that there's a secure transfer and storage of election materials like ballots or ballot boxes, and that both people are free from manipulation or coercion, and our technology is free from any hacking. I think that these measures are especially important right now, not only because we're dealing with a public health and an economic crisis, but because the 2016 election was fraught with evidence of tampering, potential foreign undue influence, and because we've already seen a breakdown in the Democratic primaries this year. The issues that the Dems faced in Iowa with voting by app really undermined the validity, excuse me, of those results, although we've been repeatedly assured that everything was ultimately reported properly. So as important as it is to understand the election security measures, it's hard to put that knowledge into context without reviewing what powers the federal government has to make changes to our election law and what's really under the purview of the states. But I want to be clear that election law is very, very complex. There's a lot of case law and precedent that defines what our state elections look like and how the federal government and the states fund those efforts. So what I hope to make clear is why most bills out of Congress ask specifically for funding for states to make changes, and why there are fewer bills from Congress that simply dictate what the states should or must do moving forward. So the Elections Clause of Article 1 of the Constitution contemplates both a federal role and a very robust state role in elections. It allows states to determine the times, places, and manner of congressional elections, but only subject to Congress's authority to make or alter those regulations. Basically, whenever a state enacts a law that relates to a congressional election, it's exercising its power under the Elections Clause. States don't have any other inherent authorities to enact these kinds of measures. Time, place, and manner generally includes rules about public notices, how we register voters, protections for voters, fraud prevention, things like that. And basically, the process is about how votes are counted and reported. At any point, Congress can pass federal laws regulating congressional elections that preempt any contrary state statutes. But for the most part, Congress has refrained from encroaching on time, place, and manner logistics. The federal government generally only intervenes to protect against things like discrimination, violence or intimidation that may take place during elections or at polling places, or to enact its own regulations concerning something that the states didn't tackle. I think it's also important to remember that most states are really decentralized in their elections processes. So a lot of the ultimate responsibility of elections is carried out on a very local level by counties and by cities. So it really is the responsibility of the states to work to fund the elections and to work with the federal government and Congress in ensuring how that plays out. So as a nation, we've managed to hold general elections during the Civil War, during World War I and the Spanish flu epidemic, during World War II, whereby we tried to boost voter turnout by sending federal ballots to all soldiers who are stationed abroad. It didn't work super well. And most recently during Hurricane Sandy in the 2012 elections, which disrupted some voting for millions of people in the Northeast Corridor. And yet to date, no presidential election has ever been suspended or postponed or delayed in the history of the United States. A general election could theoretically be postponed, but the Presidential Election Day Act, which was passed in 1845, sets Election Day as the Tuesday next after the first Monday in the month of November. So basically, you know what I'm saying. So new legislation would have to be passed and be signed by President Trump in order to move that. And then regardless of that, we're still constrained by the Constitution that says that the terms of the outgoing president and vice president have to end at noon on the 20th day of January. So our elections must go on. But obviously we can't sacrifice the lives of voters or workers or candidates in order to protect our democracy. So the good news is that we've weathered crises before, and we can do it again, but this situation requires some unique considerations that we haven't had to deal with in the past. Obviously, elections pose public health risks in the middle of a global pandemic. Standard voting practices bring together generally large groups of people. They're in public places, they're using shared machines and materials. So it creates a pretty potent recipe for spreading germs. Voters also tend to be older and thus higher risk for this virus. And the same is true of poll workers, and we certainly can't disregard a level of voter disenfranchisement. In the 2018 general election, 6 in 10 poll workers were 60 or older, and a quarter of them were over 70, which is, again, problematic given that they are at a higher risk for coronavirus. And there are concerns about a resurgence of the virus in the fall. So that, coupled with a difficulty finding poll workers, is just kind of one example of the way that the system can potentially break down during a pandemic like this, as opposed to a war, for instance. In March, a Pew poll found that 2/3 of Americans were uncomfortable going to a polling place to vote. By April, that changed to 2/3 of registered voters, almost an even split between Republicans and Democrats, who wanted to postpone primary elections for that reason. So the fear of contracting the virus while voting, rightfully so, I think, is very real. A handful of states have statutes that allow for the postponement of an election in the case of an emergency, and they grant unilateral decision-making to their governors. But there are other states, like Pennsylvania, that actually requires passing a bill to amend their election code to change primary dates. And as we saw as recently as this week, what happens when states don't take corrective action soon enough? Wisconsin's last minute change, the Supreme Court ruling against extending the absentee deadline, showed how detrimental delayed action can really be. And frankly, the real effects of that failure to take mitigation efforts may be seen in the next few days and weeks, as there could be a potential spike in community spread in the areas where those votes were taking place. So between now and the end of June, there are 21 states and the district that still have presidential primary deadlines. Only 14 have postponed in-person elections or extended their mail-in voting deadlines. 29 states currently allow for no excuse absentee voting, which is great, but 31 require a valid excuse, like you're traveling or you've been recently ill. I think most of them have a 72-hour window. Just 8 states have more than half their votes cast by mail, and 5 are currently all or mostly vote by mail, meaning that if there is an expected surge in mail voting, states and local jurisdictions are going to need to ramp up their existing operations much sooner than later. For Niskanen, we don't really see a one-size-fits-all solution for every state, but we do see the need for responsive guidelines that take seriously the risks that are associated here. Broadly, that includes changes like polling place modifications and preparations, like considering drive-by or car-side voting, mobile polling locations, expanding early voting and increasing mail-in voting, increasing the availability of online voter registration, which is going to be key to an inclusive vote in November, and expanding voter education and significantly working to reduce any fraud associated with those modalities. And Jeff will certainly get into some of the specifics about those alternative voting modalities. But quickly to close, I want to review what legislation has been introduced on election security in recent months, and what changes specifically passed in the CARES Act last month relating to election security. So in March, there were 3 election security bills that were blocked in the Senate, 2 of which were from Senators Warner and Blumenthal, that focused primarily on reporting mechanisms for suspected foreign fraud or undue influence. But overall, something like 10 bills have sort of recently languished on the Senate side in recent months, and Kodiak can probably talk a little bit more about some of those bills that were introduced. A lot of them actually predated coronavirus and really touched on some of the foreign concerns relating to influence during our elections. Senators Klobuchar, Wyden, and Coons have probably the most widely recognized bill to expand early voting, as well as vote by mail. It's called the Natural Disaster and Emergency Ballot Act, which would ensure that voters have 20 days of early voting in all states, require that all mail-in ballots submitted during the 21 days leading up to the election are counted, and ensure that all voters have the option to request absentee ballots. And I'll just highlight here, without any judgment, that this is a broad exercise of federal authority in elections and would be a permanent change, not simply a response to the emergency that's happening right now. And that may well be warranted, certainly. But given the authorities I previously laid out and Congress's past reluctance to get into the specific of elections on state level, it is a market change in our policymaking elections, and that may be what we need right now. The election also provided $3 million to the Election Assistance Commission, the EAC, to begin implementing some of the requirements and to also offer some reimbursements to the states for the things that they're doing. Specifically, the CARES Act provided about $400 million in election security grants, and I quote, to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus domestically or internationally for the 2020 federal election cycle. So this is limited emergency funding. There's not a lot of specifics in the bill, but Congress did require that states provide the EAC with a detailed report of how the funds are spent. There are no specific state-by-state distribution requirements, so it leaves a lot of the responsibility of disbursement up to EAC. So in addition to kind of keeping in mind the various registration and voting modalities available, I think it's also important to keep in mind the timing. Are these permanent or emergency changes? And whether the federal government is going to require all states to make certain changes or allow states a little bit more flexibility in determining their own needs. Lastly, I'll note that many states are gearing up for legal challenges on voting practices, both as they exist now and against some of the potential changes that lawmakers have discussed. So I'll stop there and I'm happy to answer any questions moving forward, but for now I will turn it over to Jeff to tell you a little bit more about some of our key changes and the policy debates over the provisions and the successes of some of these measures in places like Oregon and Colorado.
Thank you very much, Christy. I am going to give a kind of political gloss on some of the political situation, and to some extent this may overlap with what Christy has just said. But I think that those of us who are working in this space have a number of shared concerns. And if I were to sort of take this to the 20,000-foot level, I would say that our main concern is that we don't want the 2020 election to be both a logistical but also a moral and democratic disaster. We can't have this election be one in which large numbers of voters are effectively disenfranchised. And we can't have this end in a contested result. If this were to happen, this would be a disaster for the United States' standing in the world and really for the legitimacy of American democracy. So this is, I think, the goal to which we are working toward, and this is a bipartisan goal. However, there are a number of disagreements about aspects of what we should do and how we should do it. Again, if I were to sort of say what people have in common when they talk about how this election should be conducted, is that we want the election to be free, we want it to be fair, we want it to be accessible, we want it to be safe, and we want it to be secure. In terms of a little more specifics here, the election should not imperil anyone who is sick or afraid of getting sick in the midst of this global pandemic. And that includes poll workers as well as voters, as Christy said. A majority of poll workers in this country are over age 60. So part of the logistical disaster that we saw in Wisconsin this week came from a shortage of poll workers as well as an absence of polling places. It should be important that in this election that anyone who doesn't show up in person to vote in a polling place should still be able to cast a ballot without having to overcome extraordinary hurdles. And it's important that every ballot that's cast should be counted. And finally, it's important that the election should be perceived to be legitimate as well as to be legitimate, that the results should be announced in a timely manner, and that all Americans should abide by those results. Now, probably the leading organization which has been discussing the quandaries that face us as we approach this election is the Brennan Center for Justice. And Christy sort of outlined some of the provisions that they have foremost in mind about how we should approach this election. One of which is that there should be a universal vote by mail option. Now, even the Brennan Center, which is perceived by many Republicans as having a somewhat liberal cast, is not saying that it should be universal vote by mail, period. It is simply that in a time when many people are going to be reluctant to show up in person to cast their ballots, everyone should have the option of being able to vote from home by mail. And this is not a huge departure from current electoral practice. In 2016, 23% of all votes cast were cast by mail, and in 2018, the figure was 26%. And as Christy mentioned, there are 5 states, Utah, Washington, Oregon, Hawaii, and Colorado, that will run all mail elections in 2020. And in, I guess it is 29 states, any voter has the right to request a ballot without an excuse. However, there are a number of states, I think 17 last time I checked, which would have to change their policies to allow all who want to vote by mail to do so. And some restrictions are fairly draconian. In South Carolina, for example, illness is an acceptable reason for requesting an absentee ballot, but it has to be a doctor's ordered excuse, and you have to be in the ER of a hospital in the 4 days prior to the election. Merely being dreadfully ill at home is not going to cut it. Now, the Brennan Center has also laid out a number of other what they see as essentials for an orderly 2020 election in a time of pandemic. And these would include, as Christy said, the need for some kind of polling place modification and preparation, including the ability to do what's called drive-by voting, where you actually deliver a ballot without getting out of your car necessarily. They're also calling for expanded early voting. They would prefer a period of at least 2 weeks in which you could cast a ballot and it could be received in a polling place, but they think that there's at least a need for a minimum of 5 days. And they're also calling for expanded means of online voter registration and an expansive program of voter education. And there are a number of contestations over these issues. For example, civil rights groups are actually very much against the requirement that every state move to vote by mail, because this presents a number of obstacles in, for example, Native American communities, where access to mailboxes is actually very difficult. It presents obstacles to people for whom English is not a language with which they have facility. And there are a number of other issues too, relating to even the question of expense to return a ballot to a place where it can be counted. Now, this should not be a partisan issue. Throughout the entire country's history, both Republicans and Democrats have stood for the absolutely essential bedrock right of every citizen to cast a ballot who is eligible and to have that vote counted. However, the unescapable reality is that this is becoming a partisan issue with the conservative media ecosystem and a number of individual Republican politicians from President Trump on downward opposing a universal vote by mail option. And the Democratic bills that Christy mentioned, particularly the Wyden-Klobuchar-Coons bill, did call for $2 billion. And that was a total taken directly from the recommendations of the Brennan Center. I believe that when Nancy Pelosi introduced her proposal, she called for $4 billion, perhaps on the argument that if you request twice of what you really realistically expect to get, you're better off. And it's fair to note that the Republicans countered with their offer of some $400 million. So this actually shows that there is a bipartisan basis for supporting an election under the conditions that are likely to take place in times of pandemic. However, the best estimates are that that amount would only be 1/4 to 1/5 of the total that actually would be needed. So let's talk about the Republican objections as they have surfaced so far. One of which early on was that this was simply unnecessary, that no one knows how the course of this pandemic will proceed, and that it's entirely possible that by November, there won't be any issue for people showing up in person to cast their ballots. However, maybe could be is not really the basis on which you want to entrust the sanctity of your national elections. And I have heard much less of this argument coming from either side, Republicans or Democrats, in recent times. What you hear much more of from Republicans is that vote by mail, particularly a universal vote by mail option, would be susceptible to fraud and undue influence. You also hear the call that much of what Democrats are proposing would go against our federal system of government, that it would amount in effect to a nationalization of the electoral system, which is prescribed by the Constitution to give considerable authority both to states and localities. And that this would also impose a sort of universal pattern on what is our patchwork of state and local locus of authority and control. And then what many Republicans appear to be thinking, and we know this because President Trump tends to say the quiet part out loud, is that higher voter turnout will be bad for Republicans. And to the extent that universal vote by mail option leads to higher turnouts, this will lead to Republicans taking it on the chin and losing at all levels. And in fact, what we saw in Wisconsin was a case where a Republican Secretary of State had earnestly requested the Republican-controlled legislature to make allowances for the difficulties of preparing for a primary vote in times of pandemic. A primary vote that I should add was also a general election, so far as mayoral offices and particularly a Supreme State Court Justice office was concerned. And again, there's very few people willing to say this on the record, but the observation seemed to be that the Republicans in the state legislature calculated that it would be to their advantage to have a situation in which, for example, there were only 5 polling places available for the 600,000 registered voters in Milwaukee, as opposed to the customary hundreds. This is not a good place for us as a democracy, and I think there are ways, with the Niskanen Center being on the center right, can argue rationally to the legitimate fears of our Republican counterparts, both in the media and in the Congress and in state legislatures and just at the voter of regular grassroots voters. So as to the argument that it's not necessary, it is necessary. I think most people agree that it is necessary to prepare for the possibility that there will be serious disruption to the November elections because of the pandemic. And furthermore, it cannot wait until October to actually do something about this. This is an issue that has to be dealt with now. Frank LaRose is the Republican Secretary of State of Ohio, and he wrote what I thought was rather an eloquent letter to the Republican-controlled Ohio State Legislature with the backing of the Republican governor of the state, Mike DeWine, pointing out that it would be essentially impossible to hold a primary election under these conditions earlier than June 2nd. And this is because there needs to be a considerable amount of money, logistical preparation, and a reordering of the electoral infrastructure to accommodate the printing of extra ballots, the mailing of these out to all voters in the states, the payment for expense-paid return ballots, the need to hire more poll workers to account for the unprecedented surge in mail-in responses, and they need to have more counters to count the ballots so that the reports can be resulted in a timely manner. And the legislature did not buy it, and they went ahead to order an April 23rd date instead. And it's likely that the results there may well repeat the disasters that we saw in Wisconsin. So it is necessary to deal with this issue now. There is no evidence that moving toward expanded vote by mail results in significant fraud. Colorado has the nation's second highest voter turnout, and it has had essentially no issues of fraud in its experience, and in fact is generally rated the most secure of any state when it comes to the sanctity of elections. Oregon, since it moved to vote by mail, has had 100 million ballots cast since 2000, and it's only come up with 12 cases of fraud during that entire time. It is true that expanding absentee voting would require setting aside for one election the rules governing ballot requesting in advance or the excuses needed in certain states where those rules apply. However, the Democrats have backed off of some of the more ambitious plans to actually reorder and nationalize the way that elections are conducted. There's no talk at this point of moving toward all internet voting, let alone sort of one pattern for all states. And furthermore, I think maybe to the most important argument, there is no actual evidence that moving to universal vote by mail option leads to a partisan advantage for either side. The most comprehensive political studies that have been done on Colorado and Washington from 2016 on have shown that moving toward universal vote by mail does in fact increase turnout, but this plays in ways that advantage both Republicans and Democrats. It does increase turnout among young people, who tend to break disproportionately to the Democrats. But on the other hand, it also increases turnout among independents who can be persuaded to vote Republican. And it also increases turnout among elderly. In fact, currently the elderly, those over age 65, that is currently the group that votes the most by mail right now. And if, as seems likely, in November there is still considerable fear of pandemic, the group that is likeliest to fear going to the ballot most will be those elderly voters who provide much of the Republican Party's base. Now, so let us say then that the Republicans are inclined to negotiate in good faith with the Democrats and vice versa in Congress toward a greater appropriation to the states and localities to handle the likelihood of an election that otherwise would be disrupted by the pandemic. There are some things that I think the Republicans are likely to ask that the Democrats would be wise to give way to in this case. One of which would be a halt in this election to the process known as community ballot collection and delivery, which Republicans like to call ballot harvesting. And this is when a voter who may have trouble getting to a mailbox to cast an absentee ballot can designate someone else to cast the ballot for them. And there's a wide range of practices employed by the states to allow some kind of community ballot collection and delivery. This could be simply that you provide postage-paid envelopes to return. It could be that you can designate someone who is part of your immediate family. But there are also some states like California where an individual can designate anyone to be their agent to collect and deliver the ballot. And this has caused considerable hard feelings among Republicans across the spectrum. I actually used to work fairly closely with Doug Osee, who was a Republican congressman from around Sacramento in the 7th District. And in 2014, he lost to Democrat Amy Barra by an extremely narrow margin, something like 0.8% of the vote. And Republicans almost universally blamed the practice of organizations like SAYU, which on a large scale had invested efforts into collecting and delivering ballots, particularly for people who were incapacitated and in facilities, medical facilities. And I think the Democrats would be wise to give way in this election at any rate when Republicans come back on this practice. I also think that Republican concerns about fraud are, if exaggerated, not necessarily entirely misplaced. And there could well be means of detecting fraud which do not unduly intimidate voters, which could be adopted as well. These could include cameras on the drop boxes where voters would have the opportunity to return their ballots. This could include special task forces to ensure the efficient correction and collation of voter signatures and addresses, again, in a way that is not aimed to disenfranchise anybody, perhaps with bipartisan participation. There was also considerable Republican concern in the 2018 elections that as the vote in places like California dribbled in the days and even weeks after the election, that close elections swung toward the Democrats. Very few actual accusations of outright fraud were legitimated here, but there is Republican concern that votes should not be allowed to be cast right up until or indeed after election day itself. And I think it actually is important in order to have a legitimate election that is widely abided by, that we have the electoral results reported as soon as possible after the polls close across the country. And this again will require some states to modify their practices, given that many states, not many states, but some states actually don't allow ballots to be counted, mail-in ballots to be counted, until the polls close. At any rate, again, there would be some room for negotiation between Republicans and Democrats in terms of when you can postmark a mail-in ballot in advance of the election and have it counted. Finally, although it's a pretty strong sticking point for Democrats and even some liberal-leaning organizations like the Brennan Center to request that all voters be sent absentee ballots, a number of Republican-leaning states have gone to a sort of a midway meeting, which is that they're not sending out ballots to all voters through the mail, but they are sending out applications to all voters to request an absentee ballot. So most recently, for example, in West Virginia, the Republican Secretary of State, Mac Warner, just said that this is what he would do. And you also see this practice going on in Georgia and in Nebraska as well. And this actually does represent a significant liberalization of voting practices from what had been the practice before that. And I think here again, the Democrats would be wise to accept half a loaf in this case, in the interest of having an election that proceeds even amidst the rather dreadful circumstances of this current pandemic. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kodiak, and I'm happy to take questions as well.
Thank you, Christy and Jeff. The upside of having such brilliant colleagues is that they do all the heavy lifting of setting the stage for you. The downside is that they also make most of the salient points in this conversation. So I will do my best to lay out my remarks and kind of emphasize some of the points that we've heard just now from Christy and Jeff. So first and foremost, election security and voting accessibility should not be partisan, but I think as you've heard for the last 35 minutes, they are. And as a result, it's particularly important to have conservative voices championing this cause because it adds legitimacy to the idea that this is not a Republican issue, this is not a Democrat issue, it's nonpartisan. So in this regard, the Niskanen Center is particularly well positioned to lead because we have established relationships on the Hill. I think if you're familiar at all with our work, one of the things that makes us unique in the think tank space is that we spend a lot of our time and efforts getting to know congressional offices, committee staff, and really working to open lines of communication and develop the sorts of relationships where when staff have questions, they turn to us as a resource. And that is particularly helpful in a time like this and in a crisis like this. So achieving meaningful federal support for election security efforts has to be bipartisan. We saw that in the CARES Act. Senator McConnell didn't want to support any funding for state election security measures when the package was originally formed. But when it passed, it included $400 million. So there's clearly some willingness to move politically, but it has to be a bipartisan effort. And it's worth repeating, and this seems very pedestrian, but hang in there with me. It's an election year, which typically means that there's less bipartisanship, less willingness to reach across the aisle to work together, because you're literally competing head to head in a war of ideas to keep your seat, to keep your majority. So I think some of the bills that Christy referenced earlier, unfortunately, they're mostly partisan bills. So it's really important right now to create space for both parties to find a way to come together, in consideration of the fact that, again, it seems obvious, but it's an election year. So I think it's important that proposals stay as neutral politically as possible. And for example, and Jeff mentioned this, the community ballot collection, which is often cited in more, what I would say, traditionally liberal platforms as a great mechanism to help aid voting accessibility. It's just a non-starter with Republicans. They don't even want to talk about it. So if you're coming with proposals that have provisions like that, you're automatically giving them less space to find points of agreement with you. So I think it's really important to conceptualize how you're doing this work with those considerations. And I think some other key considerations that are worth touching upon. The House and Senate are unlikely to return on their previously anticipated April 20th date. And this is problematic for a variety of reasons, and also understandable for a variety of reasons. State funding and support efforts really would need to ramp up as early as May to be truly effective. That includes not just the infrastructure that Jeff really talked about, but also the educational efforts. Voters don't necessarily know what's happening, and if they don't understand what's happening, they're not going to exercise whatever modality the state chooses. They're just going to be confused. They may stay home. So that's a really important thing to consider, even though it's early in April. November is really not that far away, and these state efforts are really going to need to ramp up in pretty short order in order to be truly effective. And with the House and Senate unlikely to return at their previously anticipated date, that creates some confusion about when this would be possible. It makes it even more important that proposals that are being championed are actually plausible and nonpartisan and have the political capital to be able to be reasonable and actually be passed potentially. As we saw with the CARES Act, there's a lot of negotiation that goes on behind the scenes, and you really need to be prepared with a proposal that can pass and not kind of a wish list. So with that being said, looks like we're having some questions roll in, and what we're going to try to do, we're going to try to answer the questions in the order in which they come in. We have about 20 minutes, so please feel free to get your questions in. And if in the event that we're not able to get to every question, the email address that you received the invitation to this briefing for, you can write a question, you can email that address, and we will get back to you with a thorough response. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the first question to both Christy and Jeff. Why is federal support necessary for voting, which is administered by the states? I think this is a great question.
Yeah, I'm happy to tackle that. That is a good question. So generally speaking, the states do pay for their elections. It's interesting that most of them don't really know exactly what their election administration costs are. Primarily because, you know, they have a lot of elections, and also because there are a number of federal statutes that can potentially complicate what some of their costs are going to be every year. The largest expenditure that the federal government has made to state elections happened in 2002 in response to the hanging Chad debacle that occurred. And so the Congress passed HAVA, which was the Help America Vote Act, which was by far the most significant financial contribution that the federal government has made to the states to run their own elections. And I will say too, that the only other thing that sort of makes this a unique situation that could potentially call for more federal funding is that, generally speaking, the federal government also has said that they will absorb costs when there are circumstances that are sort of unexpected right before election seasons, like, for instance, a global pandemic that would require them to get involved. But otherwise, generally speaking, the states do fund their own elections.
I don't think I can add much to what Christy just said, but it's my job at Niskanen to pull in the most erudite reference possible. So I would quote the English philosopher R.G. Collingwood. In his philosophical discourse upon freedom, he pointed out that you are not free to play a piano if you have a piano but don't know how to play it. And by the same token, you're not free to play a piano if you know how to play it but don't have a piano. And in this case, the states are coming against the issue that they have really neither the means nor the opportunity to conduct the elections that would be on a universal vote by mail option in the way that they would like. And in particular, what this election is doing is not just leading to 17 million unemployed claims coming down, it is also cratering state and local finances. And therefore, the states and localities simply do not have the money that is necessary for the additional logistical requirements to conduct a vote by mail election on this scale. And if the federal government doesn't step in and make it possible, it's simply not going to happen.
Jeff, I'm so glad that you made that point, and I would like to reiterate, maybe it's my job today to just repeat what seems painfully obvious, but may not be so. State revenues are down. Quite simply put, their budgets are under strain, and at this point, federal funding could really alleviate some of those pressures to make sure that these elections are held timely, safely, and securely. All right, our next question. As Congress prepares the next COVID-19 response bill, what is the #1 thing Christy and Jeff would recommend to Hill staffers looking to inform their bosses on this issue? Great question.
Go for it, Christy.
Okay. You know, I think the most important thing for staffers and lawmakers to think about is that in order to get a bill that's not trying to push a one-size-fits-all solution in front of every single state, they really need to think strategically about the needs of each state. There are some states that still have leftover HAVA funds that they haven't needed to use, that they can potentially use to make any of the changes that they need to make. And as Jeff detailed earlier, not every state is going to have to stand up huge changes to their voting modalities to ensure that this is an inclusive vote. So what I think I would recommend, and I hope this isn't punting the question, but I think what I would recommend is that staff take the time, and we're helping to try and help them through this kind of thinking exercise, to look at the needs of their states, to look at the demographics, to consider what may need to be done in the next weeks, and to think about what their structures really look like. Is it something that they can change under the authority and the purview of the governor? Is it something they're going to have to pass legislation to change? What exactly is going to get them to the place that is going to ensure that they have a successful election? And that requires a lot of engagement from a lot of people with staff and with their states to figure out exactly what that is. I think the good news is that we've seen from a lot of secretaries of state and from people that are involved in local and state elections that they really are already thinking through this process. And hopefully that information is translated well to lawmakers on Capitol Hill that are open to making some of these changes.
I'd just second again everything that Christy said. I think it's important for people in the Congress, particularly Republican legislators, to go back to their states and ask the people who are charged with this responsibility, what do you need? How can we best support you at the federal level in order to have a successful election in which there is no disenfranchisement and which the election results will not be open to question? And this does mean talking to whoever has authority in the states, which really is a patchwork. In some cases, it actually is the governor or the secretary of state or electoral committees or the state legislature. You have to be realistic about this because in some states, like I think South Carolina, there's actually only one legislative day that's going to be happening between now and August in which this can be done. There is as yet unexplored territory in terms of the emergency powers of any people, particularly governors, to actually make changes in order to allow an election to proceed under these kind of pandemic conditions. There are as yet unresolved questions with the courts. But I think the most important thing is simply to emphasize to everyone that there is no partisan advantage to an electoral disaster. Much as there is no partisan advantage to a natural disaster. These are going to affect Republicans and Democrats equally, and we all will pay the price in terms of our world standing, in terms of our democratic legitimacy, if we actually have an electoral disaster come November.
The only thing that I would add to Christy and Jeff's points is that I think a role that Niskanen certainly is playing right now, and one that our partners in this effort are playing, is to emphasize and kind of echo to Republican staffers when a Republican has taken a leadership position on this issue or has spoken out about this issue, to make sure that they're aware of it, and also that they're talking amongst themselves. It kind of breeds a sense of, okay, this is a conversation that my side of the aisle is having, and it's worthwhile to have it, and it gives them some coverage to also be thinking about this and being more invested in it as not just, a partisan kind of effort. One example is that Representative Rodney Davis from Illinois 13, he's the ranking member on House Administration. He has released a press release talking about this issue and suggesting to his chairwoman that he wants to be an active participant in coming up with solutions on election security. So making sure that other Republican staff are aware of this. It's hard to hear through the noise these days. So even something as simple as that, it can be very effective in promoting conversation. All right. Next question. Isn't there a risk that allowing vote by mail in states which are unprepared and ill-equipped might sow the sort of chaos and suspicion which would cast more doubt on the legitimacy of the results? In some cases, without proper resources, education campaigns, etc., might it be better for legitimacy, not for public health, for unprepared states to work to increase safety of in-person voting as best they can? Another great question.
I'll take the lead this time, and I'll be quick. I think that the question is a great question, and this is also why vote by mail is not a universal panacea, and why relatively few groups out there are simply saying, well, we need to move to universal voting. Universal voting does work well in many of the states that pioneered it, and these include both Democratic and Republican states. In Utah, for example, most of those candidates who win election through universal vote by mail are in fact Republicans. However, it's also something that states have had to evolve their way towards, and it's absolutely not something that can simply be done overnight. So for example, I would say best practice in terms of voting, unquestionably, I would give that to Colorado. And there's great things they have where you can actually track your ballot online as it's received through the mailing system and processed and counted. And that's awesome. However, it's just not going to be possible for every state to set that up between now and November. So I think we need to keep all kinds of options open, including the options to vote in person, which is also very useful when it comes to ballots that are rejected. In-person voting does offer an opportunity that vote by mail typically does not, to actually correct some kind of errors that are easily remediable. And also to have early voting and drive-by voting options, really to have as many options as possible so that people will be able to cast their ballots in a way that is both safe and secure.
Thank you, Jeff. Our next question, we have about 10 more minutes and it looks like 4 more questions. Have any legislators or advocacy groups suggested that the effort to secure federal elections in the face of pandemics or other emergencies would be aided by a system of state-based nationally secured voter ID?
I'll take that one. Yes, I think a lot of people for a long time have talked about the options for that. I think following the 2000 election, there was a commission that was stood up to consider some of those types of changes, and one of their recommendations was a national voter ID. But there are problems, and there are reasons that I think are valid that people are still opposing it, that we still haven't figured out how to overcome. A lot of Americans currently still lack an ID. They just don't have the money to get an ID. They don't have the underlying documents to get an ID. And this is especially true in lower income places in America. There's also a barrier for some of the elderly in accessing IDs. They tend to let any driver's licenses expire, and then they are limited in their ability to actually travel to a place to get an ID. And we've seen the GAO has reported multiple times that strict photo ID laws and voter ID laws reduce voter turnout. So while I don't think that that is insurmountable, and I think that it is still an option that people should consider, I think that we have to be realistic about the time frame, and that, you know, what we can stand up potentially in the next 6 to 7 months versus what we should consider moving forward as an effort to prepare for things like this that are going to increasingly come up. This isn't going to be the last hurdle that we face as far as making sure that we have safe and secure and inclusive elections. But for now, there still are a lot of valid concerns with a national voter ID law that we haven't quite figured out how to tackle.
And just to add to that, as a great example of what Christy's talking about as a long-term solution versus a near-term solution, Real ID, which was supposed to be implemented by October 2020, has now been delayed. This is a system that states were undergoing to kind of bring all of their IDs up to a certain level and a set of criteria, and that has not been easy to implement. So I think this would absolutely be the sort of solution that would have to be longer term. Our next question is, are there Senate Republicans that appear to be principled and open-minded on this issue and willing to deal/influence with Majority Leader McConnell? That's a great question. I think a lot of those conversations right now are really happening behind closed doors. I think, as we've talked about for the last hour, this is still really seen as a partisan issue, and trying to create space and walk that back means that a lot of these conversations have to be senator to senator and in, unfortunately, non-public forums. So I think you are going to see a Republican leadership on this issue. I think the only way that Senator McConnell was willing to include $400 million in the CARES Act was because he had not just pressure from Speaker Pelosi, but also thoughtfulness and concern from his own caucus in the Senate.
I certainly don't have access to the behind the doors conversations of senators, but I was very interested to notice that just a few days ago, Shane Scheller, who's the county clerk in Greene County, Missouri, came out and really said that they are looking for support from the state and federal level for actually making a success of this election. And to me, that's significant because Senator Roy Blunt got his start in political life as the county clerk for Greene County before going on to become Secretary of State of Missouri. And County Clerk Scheller is basically asking for the ability to set up drop boxes outside of the office so that people can turn in ballots without going into the office using the mail, so that people in more populous areas like Springfield can set up special vote centers with more usual polling space than the regular polling areas so that they can accommodate social distancing, and a number of kind of other reforms that we're looking towards. And this is a Republican county clerk. And if Roy Blunt is attuned to his own political autobiography, as I imagine he might be, then he's going to start hearing from people who are in this situation. And I hope he would pay attention.
All right, our next question is, and we have 2 more questions in about 6 minutes, so we'll try to be quick and get to everyone. What's wrong with a federal law mandating that states provide for unrestricted by-mail voting for all of its registered voters? That's a one-size-fits-all policy that doesn't strike me as unreasonable.
I'm happy to take this one. I don't think it's unreasonable. I don't think it's unreasonable at all. I think that it brings up some of the same concerns as a national voter ID law, but more specifically, to answer it right now, there are some election law experts that talk about, there could be confusion, disenfranchised voters, but more specifically and more realistically, It is very complex to roll out a change like that in states that require, the passage of new laws, changing statutes, a lot of different sort of legal mechanisms that would allow them to stand up something like that very quickly, and not have it challenged in their courts. And, I think one of Jeff's most important points is that we want to make sure that not only is this election deemed valid, but that people feel like it is a valid exercise of their right to vote. And I think that if there was sort of mass confusion and a lot of these things that were tried to stand up very quickly in states that aren't ready for them, it could undermine some of those efforts. So again, I don't think that that is unrealistic moving forward. I don't necessarily think that it would be necessary in every state, at least for now. But we have done large mail ballot efforts in the past. We do them every election season with our entire military, and it works just fine. I don't think that is necessarily the concerns about fraud or undue influence that would stop something like that happening moving forward. I really think it's more of a logistical issue that we have to overcome.
Oh, thanks, Chrissy. I think there's no question but that it would be ideal to move toward that kind of system. However, I don't want to let the best be the enemy of the good in the terrible and unprecedented circumstances that we're facing right now. I think it would be a major accomplishment to actually get bipartisan agreement on a lot of the points that we've been raising in times that are as polarized as any we've faced since the Civil War. So I don't think that this is necessarily the place for idealism. I think this is really a time for pragmatism and being able to understand what each side is willing to settle for in order not to have this election be a disaster.
Thank you. Our final question is, are you collaborating with Issue 1 reformers? And would you please mention some of your other partners in this effort? I'm happy to just run through some of the other groups that we're working with. And of course, we are open to suggestions and collaborations. We think this is such a critical issue. The more voices championing this cause, the better. So we are collaborating with Issue 1, Common Cause, Republicans for Integrity, Republican Women for Progress. We've been on calls with Bipartisan Policy Center, and again are open to other organizations that may be doing some of the same work where we could amplify their voices as well. And I'll let Jeff and Christy take a stab at that question too.
Sure, I'll just add a few more voices that I think are important. Protect Democracy, we work closely with on this issue, and they're very much attuned to it. Unite America and the Unite America Foundation has done good work in this regard. The Stand Up Republic organization is all over this, and they have also been very helpful in terms of getting intelligence from their state chapters. And we've also worked with the Bridge Alliance, which is kind of an umbrella organization, which has also paid a lot of attention to this issue.
And I'll wrap that up. I think that's an impressive list, with the fact that we continue to work with lawmakers and their staffers on the Hill, on both sides of the aisle, regardless of whether they've come out and said that they absolutely don't want to make any changes, or if they want to revamp our entire federal election system. There isn't anybody that we're unwilling to work with, and we think that it's important to engage as many people as possible in these reform efforts. Like Jeff said, we're trying to find something that can actually get done, that can ameliorate the immediate concerns that we have for this election, while of course setting the stage for longer term reforms. We'll continue those conversations. We'll continue to try and inform those conversations, and hopefully in the next days, weeks, and hopefully fewer than months, we'll have some kind of consensus around what the states need to do and what it's going to cost for them to do it.
Thank you all so much for spending your afternoon with us to talk about election security in light of the COVID pandemic. If you have any further questions or anything you'd like more information about, please, again, email the address that sent you this invitation. And thank you to Christy and Jeff for your insight and for sharing your afternoon with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.